So one useful way to learn vocabulary if you're learning a language which is closely related to yours or fairly closely related to yours is to learn the correspondences between cognates in your language and the foreign language. So if I were to say fish with a Scottish accent, I'd say fesh. If I were to say, can I have some fish, in a Scottish accent, although that's not necessarily the way you speak if you're from anywhere other than Scotland, you understand what I mean because your brain has learned a sort of algorithm whereby if it hears an eh in a Scottish accent, it turns it into an I, and if it hears an ah in a Scottish accent, it turns it into an ah. And those are very, very subtle changes in sound, so it's not very hard to do. As soon as you've picked up the phonology of Scottish, which doesn't take very long and you do it as a child, you come to understand an enormous amount of it, because your brain gets to the point where it can, the algorithm can make up what a word would sound like even if you've never heard it before, just because you know what the patterns are. Now this might all sound quite obvious, but it's how Old English speakers probably came to terms with Old Norse when it started being spoken, when Norse settlers started appearing in Britain about 1,000 years ago, and Jackson Crawford's done quite a good video on that, on the correspondences between one and the other. All you need to do is get used to those correspondences and your brain can start to automatically turn words from one language into what they would be in the other language. One issue with this is that meaning shifts happen quite a lot, whereby although a word might be cognate, for example a German word might be cognate with an English word, the meaning has shifted slightly in the 1700 years since they diverged, in which case obviously they then don't mean the same thing, although you might be able to guess roughly what the meaning is, because it normally doesn't stray too far, although that's, I say normally, often it does. You can do the same thing with a lot of modern languages, and that's how it helps, that's how it's practical in modern terms. So for example, if you take the I sound in German, it often corresponds to, if we're talking ancient languages, then an A sound in Old Norse and an R sound in Old English, and they all correspond often with an O sound in modern English. So you get Stein in modern German, then Stein in Old Norse, Starn in Old English, and then stone in modern English. You get another example Jackson Crawford used was heim, heim, harm, home, bein, bane, barn, bone, ein, ein, arn. Hang on a minute. This did confuse me quite a bit when I first noticed it, because even the spelling of the word is as we would expect it to be in accordance with the other languages. Reconstructions of Shakespeare's accent, or the accent his plays were written in, show it pronounced as own. Some of the rhymes, some of the sonnets just wouldn't have worked if it was pronounced with a W at the start, as in one. So since we know the Victorians were saying one, that gives about 200, 250 years in which it switched at some point. One of those internet etymology websites gives the date as sort of late 17th century, which sounds like, well, it sort of makes sense to me, but I still don't have any idea why it went from own to one. If you're wondering how the vowel can change that drastically, just think that in some English accents you have something like stone, but in some English accents you have stone, and if O can turn into O, then in the span of sort of 1600 years of divergent evolution, you can imagine that something like O can become something like I between English and German. So it can happen. The complicated thing is consonant shifts. In some ways it's complicated because it takes a lot longer for them to happen, and in other ways it's simple because the span of time it takes for them to happen mean that they're quite consistent between English and German, so you can't rely that much on vowel shifts being consistent between modern German and modern English, because so many little things can change the way a vowel's pronounced in an individual word, so there end up being so many exceptions and so many little sub-rules that it's very hard to get them all into your head, whereas with consonants it tends to be a lot more consistent. So here are some examples. So where in German you have a t, you often have a d in English. German d, becomes English th or the. A final s in German becomes a t in English. An initial t in German becomes a d in English. A ck, so a k in German often becomes a j in English, a dg, sorry. Ts sound in German, represented by z, often becomes a t in English, and a German pf, so pf, often becomes just an English p. So if I go through some words and we'll see how that works. So you have Hut, das, Gürtel, Pfad, Brücke, Mücke and Rück. So you have the cognates of those, which are, if you haven't already worked it out, hood, that, girdle, path, bridge, midge and ridge. But the actual meanings of the words are, in some cases, slightly different. So you end up here with hat, that, belt, path, bridge, midge and back. Back is in the back. In Old English it was something like rich, which makes sense. And obviously the rück is where we get the ruck in rucksack, because that's the ruck there is a loan word from German. A g sound in German often totally disappears in English, or it becomes a y sound. So this is why the ig or ich suffix in German becomes an e in English, so 20 becomes 20. So you have a word like Vogel, the cognate of which is fowl, and the actual meaning is sort of bird. It's much more common than fowl is in English. And then you have Wagen. Now Wagen is a bit of a confusing one, because in German, in English, sorry, we have the word wagon, which is a loan word from German. The actual English word, the native English word, is wain, but nobody really says that, it's very rarely used. And then we have another example, Zagel, which becomes tail. I think there's also Schnegel, which becomes snail. I think the actual meaning of that is something like slug. One word I found quite interesting was Zeichen, because the meaning is sign, and I always assumed it was a cognate of sign, not really knowing the correspondences very well, because it sounds a bit like sign, but it's not actually, it's a cognate of token, as you might already have worked out. And that goes back to the I becoming O thing that we were talking about earlier. And lo and behold, in Old English, the word taken is used for the same thing. So although the meaning might shift, you can often at least get a good idea of what the word for something might be in a closely related language, just by applying these sort of algorithms, these patterns that tend to stick. More so in consonants than in vowels, but obviously that depends how close the language actually is. Fuck, there's milk on my hand now. Thank you. I'm going to try and make some more videos, because I now actually have access to my camera, and it's summer, and I've got some ideas in my head. We'll see how that goes, but I am feeling quite video-y at the moment. So, see you in a bit.